Greetings, I'm Thomas Brodhead, editor of the new Ives 4th Symphony Critical Edition Performance Score, and I'm going to allay your fears about this piece. No longer should conductors be afraid of it, it's been tamed and made seaworthy. To understand the new edition and what it solves, it's essential first to provide brief publication history of the work. The second movement was first published, fully and beautifully engraved, by Henry Cowell in his New Music publication in January 1929. This second movement score appeared as Ives presented it in the manuscript, full of multimetrics such as 3 bars of 4/4 played by one instrument with 4 bars of 3/4 played by another instrument, where quarter equals quarter between the two instruments, so the beats align, but the bar lines are in different locations. However, Ives used far more complex multimetrics, like this. Here is a page from the second movement of the Fourth Symphony showing multimetrics. So I'll zoom in so you can see this and clearly. So here you can see the clarinet is continuing a measure that began on the previous page, and then it goes to a 3/16 bar, 5/16, 7/16, 3/16, 4/16. The bassoon beneath it has a 4/4 bar followed by a 3/4 bar. The orchestra piano is playing a meter that began on a different page, and then it goes into 3 measures of 3/16, then 1 measure of 4/16, then 3/16, then 4/16, then 6/16, completely different than what you have in the clarinet. And so it goes throughout this page. Now, the multimetrics were the least of the performance problems posed by this first publication of the second movement in 1929. There are a host of polytemporal passages, including dyssynchronies, in which different parts of the orchestra play at different rates of speed simultaneously, often accelerating or decelerating their tempos against the tempo of the main orchestra. Perhaps because Ives could not think of notational conventions that would convey these things, and at the time there simply weren't any, he described their intended effects and many other minutiae in a thornily written conductor's note that accompanied this 1929 publication of the second movement. This conductor's note explicates parts of the second movement score where asterisks above instrumental parts or next to tempos, etc. And I will now show you one. So here is an asterisk, and here's another one. They're always star-shaped, and these refer to the conductor's note to the second movement only. Sadly, not every asterisk in the full score had a corresponding entry in the conductor's note, and as stated earlier, Ives's language in the conductor's note is difficult to read and easy to misinterpret. But that was all that Ives left for us of his Fourth Symphony when he died in 1954, except for the manuscripts to the other 3 movements. And so, a team of 3 librarians of the Free Library of Philadelphia, Franceschini, Sater, and Falcone, assembled a provisional performance score of the entire symphony for its premiere by Leopold Stokowski in April 1965, 11 years after Ives's death. That score was subsequently published by G. Schirmer, and until the new edition was premiered in August of 2012, it was the only edition available, and henceforth will be called the 65 score. Now, what did it, the 65 score, provide conductors and interpreters? Very little. It had a foreword by John Kirkpatrick providing the compositional history of the work. It reproduced Ives's confusing conductor's note to the second movement, and it ironed out the multimetrics like the one on display with this. So here is the same page we looked at before, but now with just 2 meters for all the instruments, a 4/4 bar and then a 3/4 bar. And if I zoom in, you can see that where the clarinet had all those crazy metrics before, it now just has 2 measures, and likewise for the primo orchestra piano. This is only possible, of course, because 16th note equals 16th among all the different instruments. Now, this is my engraving of the page. In the 1965 score, this was done with very sloppy hand copying, and sloppy, difficult to read hand copy was used throughout the 1965 score. First, in hand copied patches laid on top of engraved passages in the second movement to cover up the multimetrics. 2, in hand copied patches that replaced entire engraved pages of the second movement. And then 3, in sloppy hand copying on the whole for the other movements. Movements 1, 3, and 4 were completely hand copied, sloppily. And the parts themselves were sloppily copied, with no cues whatsoever, adding insult to injury. But forget that. What I've described is all that the 65 score had. Specifically, it contained ironed out simple multimetrics, a confusing conductor's note to the second movement, and nothing else. Countless conductors understandably misunderstood the instructions in the conductor's note to the second movement, but then there were many more things that hadn't made their way into the 65 score that needed to be there so that Ives's intentions for the piece would be clear, both for the second movement and for the other three movements. My goal was not to make a new score that would fit the piece into a Procrustean bed of one interpretation of the manuscripts, but instead to bring to the surface all of Ives's stated intentions so the conductors and players would understand what he intended, including copious optional effects and reorchestrations. This would therefore allow conductors and players to make informed choices about how to interpret and perform the piece, and of course also to have the best possible engraving of the score and parts so that players wouldn't have to struggle to read the music. I also realized as I prepared the edition that just because something was clear to me, it might not be clear to someone else. I have lived with this piece and studied it intensely since I was 15 years old, so I know every jot and tittle in it. But this is paradoxically a problem. My own familiarity with it might cause me not to realize that something that's obvious to me is not obvious to someone else. Most importantly, the conductors and musicians reading the score and parts and performing it. Thus, I realized that the performance score would initially be a work in progress and would require real-world feedback from orchestras of all calibers to discover where things were clear and where they were not clear, and then it would require revision as necessary. To date, I've attended 8 sets of rehearsals and performances, 4 in Europe and 4 in the United States, and I've collected feedback from everyone: musicians, conductors, orchestra librarians, and even stagehands. The written foreword to the score was merely 17 pages long at the Lucerne premiere in August 2012. It's now 37 pages long and is copiously illustrated. Now, here's a rundown on what's in the front matter of the edition. After going over it, I'll show you what should be very interesting examples of how the score and parts clarify the music for the conductor and for the performing musicians graphically, that is, by the power of self-describing notation. Survival Guide. This is a 12-page illustrated compendium of everything the conductor or conductors must apprehend before the first rehearsal. Now I'm going to go through this in detail at the end, but just for now I'm going to flip through it so you can just see what's there. As you see, it goes on for 12 pages and their musical illustrations. Next section, part pages that may require explanation. In this are reproductions of all the potentially difficult part pages that players may have questions about. Having those pages reproduced in the front matter allows the conductor to learn in advance what those players will be seeing so that she or he can be prepared to answer questions by those players, as well as to allow the conductor to flip to the front matter to see the part page in question if a question comes up in rehearsal. This therefore eliminates the conductor's need to leave the podium to see the player's part, or the need for a player to leave his or her desk to consult the conductor at the podium with the part in question. And this goes on for 4 pages. Boom. There's the next page. The next section is alternative notations in the parts. It's just 2 pages. Many of Ives's rhythmic subdivisions are difficult to execute, and so every one of them deemed difficult has been provided an alternative analytical renotation that parses the rhythm within the beat units of its actual meter. When employed, the original notation and the analytical renotation appear on 2 stacked staves. Some of the renotations are truly helpful, and musicians have confirmed this to me during rehearsals. Others seem overly complicated even to me, and I worked hard to find the clearest renotation that reproduced the intended rhythm exactly. But even the ones that resulted in a thorny-looking rhythm are provided anyway, for the sake of being thorough. The notation that is most likely to be read by the player, either Ives's original notation or the analytical renotation, is placed on the top staff in order to be closer to tempo markings and so on. The commentary in this section of the front matter offers opinion whether a renotation is truly useful for performance, or perhaps something players would simply benefit from reading during individual practice. Now on this 2-page spread we have consult conductor questions on the parts and the program of movement to the Celestial Railroad. I'll start with consult conductor questions. Ives offered a dizzying array of alternative orchestrations, for example, having 2 violins play in place of 2 flutes during a soli passage. Sadly, none of these alternative orchestration suggestions appeared in the 1965 score and in its parts. That's been corrected in this edition, with each such indication appearing in the full score and in the parts, each marked in the parts consult conductor. However, they're somewhat hidden in the minutiae of the full score itself. To safeguard this aspect of the score and to ensure that the conductor understands that they're there and can find them all, here is a complete listing of all of them. It references each of their locations in the full score. The conductor may therefore go through the listing, examine the score, make reorchestration decisions, and then tell the orchestra librarian to mark the parts for the players accordingly. On the next page, we have the program of movement 2, the Celestial Railroad. Now, my own musicological work in the 1980s revealed that the second movement is actually a Straussian tone poem on the Nathaniel Hawthorne short story, The Celestial Railroad. Ives's annotations in the source manuscripts indicate the correlations of the story's plot to the musical events in the symphony movement. This short essay summarizes Hawthorne's story and provides the locations in the symphony's second movement of every event in the story, an invaluable source of information for interpreting the music. And I should add, you should make this essay available to the program annotator so that he or she can include it in the program book so that audience members can follow along with the program of the movement as they're hearing the second movement being performed. Next page. Bellman's program note to the 1927 premiere of the Prelude and Comedy movements. Now, the first two movements of the symphony were actually performed by a watered-down orchestra of just 50 members of the New York Philharmonic on a concert in January 1927. Remember I said the premiere was in 65? Well, that was for the entire symphony. The first two movements were done in 27. Now, that was the only performance of any part of the symphony that Ives heard live. Now, Bernard Herrmann, of Alfred Hitchcock fame, orchestrated the third movement, Fugue, and that was broadcast over the radio in the 1930s, but it's not clear whether Ives heard it, and even so, it was Herrmann's reworking of it, not Ives's original scoring. Nonetheless, for the 1927 concert in which the first two movements were performed, Ives ghost wrote a program note that was attributed to Henry Bellman, although it's clear and musicologically accepted that Ives wrote it himself. Because it contains Ives's own words describing the meaning of the work, it is provided in full here, with additional information and footnotes. Next page. Ives's conductor's note to movement 2. Now here's reproduced Ives's thorny conductor's note to the second movement, but with clarifications and additions of entries taken directly from the manuscript sources that explain the asterisked music in the score that had no corresponding entries in the original form of the conductor's note. Now remember I explained earlier that the second movement full score had asterisks, star-shaped symbols above instrumental lines, and the conductor's note was to include explications of each such asterisked passage. Well, it didn't. Not every asterisk in the full score had a corresponding explication in the conductor's note, and even those that did were incomplete. Here, Ives's original writings in the conductor's note are presented in boldface, and all editorial additions, clarifications, and/or interpolations are presented in Roman face, so the two may be distinguished easily. So here's the bold, and here's the Roman. And this goes on for 3 pages, and it ends with this long, confusing essay. And what is this essay? Well, I provide an explication of it. The meaning of Ives's conductor's note essay, pages 32 and 33 of your booklet. Ives's conductor's note confusingly ends with an essay on musical acoustics, distance, volume, perceived volume at a distance, and so on. This essay has previously been misunderstood. It actually intends to explain encircled letters A through G that appear throughout the second movement score. These encircled letters appear above instrumental parts in the full score, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and they change from page to page, meaning that they are changing every few measures for each player. These letters had previously been misinterpreted to mean degrees of importance, something akin to Schoenberg's Hauptstimme and Nebenstimme symbols. They do not indicate musical importance at all. They indicate the physical distance the player is to be located from the audience, all for the purpose of achieving the effect of different volumes at different distances. This is all very clear in Ives's essay if you read it carefully. Because the letters, called prominence indicators, change for each instrument from one musical passage to the next, Ives acknowledges that it would require multiple orchestras, actually 7, and special accommodations to realize this aspect of the score. This essay explains how the A to G prominence indicators function, and, importantly, the prominence indicators are reproduced in the parts for the first time. But my essay goes on to explain that the conductor should ignore them unless Ives's radical physical seating plan is being realized. Now, this is yet to happen, but it might happen in the future with some adventurous and well-funded ensemble, perhaps at a university setting, and thus the prominence indicators are reproduced in the parts and for the first time. Next, OU coordination with the BU in the finale, measures 65 through 70. In the last movement, the OU is the orchestra unit, also known as the main orchestra, and the BU is the basic unit or battery unit, a group of offstage percussionists that play a varied pattern throughout the movement. Now, I should say that BU, standing for basic unit, comes from John Kirkpatrick alone, who speculated as much in his famous temporary mimeographed catalog of the papers of Ives, found in the Yale Music Library. That is the source for that interpretation of BU. It might as well stand for battery unit, as far as I'm concerned. At any rate, they're an offstage group of percussionists that play a varied pattern throughout the movement. Now, the tempos of the main orchestra, the OU, and the percussion, BU, are different but related to each other by precise proportions, fully explained in the survival guide, and I'll get back to that at the end. This essay explains Ives' original intention of coordinating 5 instruments with the BU percussion ensemble for 6 meager measures during the finale. Because the BU percussion is playing at a different speed than the main orchestra, as well as offstage, an easily performable renotation of the passage is provided as the primary notation in the parts, and has been successfully performed everywhere from Lucerne, Berlin, Amsterdam, to Lexington, Kentucky, by the University of Kentucky Symphony Orchestra, a college orchestra at that. But in the off chance that a conductor would want those 5 players to play with the BU following its conductor during those 6 measures, something highly unlikely provided the intended spatial separation of the BU group, but still possible, a means to do so is provided in the parts and is explained in full here. Next, another 2-page spread with 2 different essays. The first, where assistant conductors might be employed. Ives conceived this work as requiring multiple conductors, and he states that explicitly in the conductor's note to movement 2. Here is provided a listing of every place in the entire symphony where additional conductors would profitably be engaged for dissynchronous or rhythmically difficult passages. This expedites the identification of the locations of those passages for the conductor. The principal conductor may then decide where to employ and where not to employ assistant conductors without having to comb through the entire score looking for those passages. The most likely candidates are all listed here. Okay. On the next page, checklist for the orchestra librarian. This was added on the advice of Detroit Symphony Orchestra librarian Robert Stiles, who pointed out to me that orchestra librarians would benefit from a blow-by-blow checklist of everything that they should have under control before the first rehearsal. Moving on to the next page, instrumentation requirements for rehearsals. Because each movement of the symphony employs a different combination of instruments, for example, the full horn section only plays in the 4th movement, and the oboes also only play during that movement, etc. Here is a listing of the instruments that are needed for each movement, which should expedite determining which players do and which players do not need to be present during a given rehearsal. This should help the conductor and the orchestra staff organize the most efficient rehearsal schedule for preparing the work. Okay, so first, here are some strings and a few other instruments playing diaphanous material. Then you see winds and brass breaking in on top of them. And the strings continue to play this light material while the winds and brass are playing this heavier material. And it looks like everything's coordinated. You have a measure, 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 right? Go to the next page, measure, 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 measure. And here's this instruction, fall away, and things are going down. So that's why it's called the collapse section, I guess, right? And then it then concludes with the revelation of the strings playing their diaphanous material again. But is that what Ives really wanted? The answer is no. Now back here, where the winds and brass enter on top of the strings, well, we see what appears to be strings just playing along with them, right? And then, as we saw on the next page, things collapsing, right? Well, the winds and brass, and actually there are more instruments than they who are part of this group, another problem that is now solved, Ives calls the upper orchestra. So everything up here and some things down here are the upper orchestra. The lower orchestra is the strings and some of the instruments up here, okay? The upper orchestra is playing in 4/4, while the lower orchestra is playing in 3/2. Okay, not so bad. As stated in the conductor's note, though, initially the two groups have evenly divided metrics, meaning that one measure of the upper orchestra equals one measure of the lower orchestra. But then, starting 3 measures after the upper orchestra enters, in other words, at this measure right here, the upper orchestra is to accelerate from quarter note equals 66 to quarter note equals 126, independently of the lower orchestra, effectively finishing the section over here before the strings have gotten to the same spot. Adding to the complexity, when the upper orchestra collapses, the basses are supposed to jump from wherever they happen to be in this material to this material down here, which is a tremoloed cluster chord, where they vamp it until the rest of the strings catch up with them. And then they're supposed to seamlessly integrate with them and then move on into the next passage without any pause whatsoever. So, how on earth can we make this graphically obvious to a conductor who hasn't read the conductor's note accurately? Well, here's the solution. In the news score, it begins as before, just the strings and a few other instruments playing this diaphanous material. It's actually a treatment of in the suite by and by. But then, aha! Notice that you have labels, upper orchestra and lower orchestra. So I've segregated the two groups. So everything that was down here below that needed to be up here has been moved there, and vice versa. So all the 4/4 instruments are on the top, and all the 3/2 instruments are on the bottom. But remember, it starts off with measure equals measure between the upper and lower orchestras. And then, starting in the 3rd measure, right here, the upper orchestra is to accelerate on top of the lower orchestra, going from 66 to the quarter to 126 to the quarter. And, most importantly of all, you can see that there are 3 measures up here and just 2 down here. So there's obviously a dysynchrony. And then it's even more clear when you flip to the next page, where you see that the upper orchestra has finished before the lower orchestra. And there are big fermatas here, showing that they are to pause and wait. And there's a cue for the assistant conductor to cue the basses in the lower orchestra to jump from wherever they happen to be over here to tremolo this clustered chord. And here is an indication that there's no pause in the lower orchestra when it moves into the next measure, as seen here. So this way, it is graphically clear what Ives' intentions are for this passage, and this eliminates the possibility of misinterpretation of Ives' intentions. Now let's look at a more extreme example of this kind of dysynchrony, something that to my knowledge had never been executed correctly before the advent of the new edition. Now here's how it appeared in the 1964 score, although here cleanly and newly engraved. So what do you see? You see an orchestra playing. If you look carefully, you can see some triplets down here in the percussion, and there are also some triplets that match them up here in the bassoons and saxophones. If you look carefully, you can see an extra violin part here, 2 players only it says, playing not triplets but some other material. Everyone seems to be together. There's some multi-metrics here, but quarter equals quarter between the groups, so you can move the bar lines over, and that's what was done on the 65 score. It doesn't seem very odd at all. You go into the next passage, and well, it's different material. But the extra violin is now 1 player. It's playing its own material. There's some sort of pause here. And then finally, at the last page, you can see something remarkable where graphically you can see the extra violin 2 and the extra viola begin to play independently of the rest of the ensemble with some bells coming in. Okay, that's not what Ives intended. You have to read the conductor's note carefully to see exactly what he wants. So in the new edition, here's how it appears, which graphically clarifies the whole mess. Aha, you can already see that there's some dysynchronies with measures not aligned and empty space following them, right? So here's what's really going on. In measure 141, right here, the saxophones, bassoons, and percussion form a static tempo group that retains its tempo, a fast allegro, through the next passage while the rest of the orchestra slows down. Well, 1 measure into the formation of the static group, and fortunately before the rest of the orchestra has begun to decelerate, 2 extra violin 2 players, players either off the stage or at the back of their section, as stated in the conductor's note, join them, albeit playing different material than the other static instruments are playing, who are playing triplets, right? Now, when the static tempo group as a whole comes to its final measure here, That includes the two extra violin two players. They must stop and wait for the other instruments to catch up with them and then rejoin them, except for one of the two extra violin two players who continues playing his or her material at that faster static tempo established before the deceleranto of the main orchestra. Now that player must continue playing its rotating musical figure at that tempo as the rest of the orchestra advances into the next section. Here, boom. So here the extra violin 2 is now one player, and it's going at the faster tempo, and then it just starts vamping this pattern while the rest of the orchestra is playing it more slowly, right? Now, this fermata is for the entire orchestra, except for the extra violin 2 player, to stop for a second to reveal the extra violin 2 player as playing on its own. It's a magical moment in the new edition. It's only then, in the next page, that the bells and the extra violin 2 then start playing this little pattern in sync, and the extra viola enters. And here these gaps show that these things are not coming in precisely at any exact location within the measure, and may be cued appropriately by the conductor. Now, the extra violin 2 part, either played by offstage players or played by players at the rear of the section, is assigned to violin 2 desk 6 in the new edition, although separate parts are provided for offstage players in case you're doing it that way, and that part is therefore rather complex. The affected part pages are reproduced among those in the front matter of the full score for the conductor to see and consider. Remember the section that had the pages from the parts that are possibly difficult to understand? And they're placed there so that the conductor can help those players. Correspondingly, these full score pages I've shown you are reproduced in the violin 2 desk 6 part and the extra violin 2 part as an appendix so that the players may study the score to understand how the part functions during this passage. Now, let's look at something far simpler, an even division of 3-2 against 4-4, for measure equals measure throughout the orchestra. Now, where is the 3-2 and where is the 4-4 in this section? You have to zoom in to see it. You can see over here, if you look carefully, that the piccolos, flutes, clarinets are in 3-2, and the bassoons are in 4-4, and the cornet is in 4-4, and the rest of the brass, except for the trombones, which are in 3-2. And then one of the two orchestra piano players, 3-2, the other's in 4-4. Most of the percussion are in 4-4, except for the Indian drum. The gong is in 3-2. Then the upper strings, including the violas, are in 3-2, but the lower strings are in 4-4. So the problem here is that, unlike the collapse section, the players assigned to each group are scattershot. It's almost impossible to tell which instrument belongs to which meter. And the conductors of the old edition largely avoided rehearsing the two groups independently for the simple reason that the two conductors couldn't easily see in the score which instruments were playing which meter in order to call out the necessary players for independent rehearsal. First, I'll show you the rest of this section. It goes on for 4 pages altogether, right? And now, here are the corresponding pages from the performance score, with 3-2 on the top and 4-4 below. The new score solves this problem by separating the two groups by meter, putting the instruments of each group in standard score order placement in 2 stacked sections, as here. So here all the 3-2 players are on top in standard score order, and all the 4-4 players are at the bottom in standard score order. And this goes on for the remainder of the section. Conductors have been making full use of this in all the rehearsals that I've attended, along with other devices presented in the score. Now there are 2 separate passages that pit 3-2 against 4-4. One of them is this one, there's another one as well, and they are each handled with identical graphical separation in the full score. But there's a fiendishly difficult section where this is also needed and has been applied, and that's next. Okay, in this section, which I've dubbed the Battle of the Triplets, the orchestra divides into 4 groups. Can you see them? Not easily. Let's zoom in so we can see them clearly. Boom, boom, boom. But let's start not at the top of the page, but the bottom. Now here we can see the basses and the cellos playing triplets on the beat. Let me zoom in a little bit more, and you can see this more clearly. Bum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum bum bum. Okay, there are some other instruments that are playing right on the beat, and they're part of this group. Above them you see the violas playing triplets as well, but they're set off by an eighth rest. And there's some other instruments that are playing material that is set off by an eighth rest. They're also triplets, like this second orchestra piano, and even some of the low brass and the saxophone. And so their material sounds like this. Bum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum bum bum. All right, you need a second conductor for that, don't you? And to make matters even more interesting, Ives throws a curveball at us and has some instruments playing the triplet figure set off by a 16th rest. So here the trumpets and the clarinets have it. So it's bum ba dum bum 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 ba dum bum 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 ba dum bum bum bum. Good luck, right? And the rest of the instruments of the orchestra are playing diaphanous material. So the problem is that unless the conductors know which instruments are playing with which group, it's impossible to rehearse this section effectively. So how do you think it's solved in the new performance score? Boom, like this. Here you have all the diaphanous material labeled as main orchestra down here. Then here's group 1, which is the triplets that are on the beat. Let me zoom in so you can see this clearly. Bum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum bum bum. Then here is group 2, triplets set off by an eighth rest. Bum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum bum bum. And then finally, the unlucky players that have to play it off by a 16th. Bum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum bum bum. So this graphically divides the groups and parses them for the conductor or conductors. The parts themselves have group number designations as well, so the conductor can call out, now let's rehearse everyone in group 2, and then everyone who's in group 2 knows to play, right? And the conductor doesn't have to look at the instrument labels to be able to call out the right instruments, but they typically will anyway. This was never done with the old score. Now let's look at some of the parts and see how they've been optimized to help the players. So let's begin by looking at a page from the full score, and then we'll move to the corresponding part. On this page we have a treatment of Camptown Races that's being ragged by the solo piano and the clarinets. So if we zoom in, you'll be able to see this clearly. Here the clarinets are going da 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 dum bum bum ba da da dum bum 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 ba da da dum. And if you go down the page, you'll see that the solo piano is playing along with them. Ba da da dum ba ba da dum bum ba da 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 dum. But what's going on in the cellos and basses, right? They're just playing ba 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 ba. It's just a 1-2 pattern, but it's bum 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 bum. Now the cellos are beamed in groups of 3 because they're playing a 3-dyad pattern. Dum bum 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 bum. Violas are playing a 4-dyad pattern, so they are beamed in groups of 4. Dun 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 dun. But it's still bum 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 bum. It's actually very simple, but it's deceptively difficult to execute. Now, from the first performance of the new edition, this passage posed a problem, not for the cellos and basses, who at every rehearsal and performance played their shared rhythm accurately and together, but instead it posed a problem for the violas, who always wanted to align their rhythm to coincide with the rhythm of the cello and bass sections. I realized that what the violas needed was a rhythmic cue line that showed what the cellos and basses were doing, so that the violas would understand that they were not synchronized with them, and that's what was done. And now I shall show it to you. Here we see a cello rhythm cue that's placed on a staff right below what the violas are reading, so they can see that they're not aligned with the cellos. That's the main concept. Before, they were actually aligning their notes with the notes of the cellos and basses, and that's not what Ives intends at all. This goes on for the entire page, and it continues. However, this only solved the problem halfway. After the rhythmic cue was added to the parts, following the third performance, the violas no longer played in synchronization with the cellos and basses. Hooray! But they still weren't playing their dyads as simple offbeats. Boo! As a group, they were still confused and weren't playing together. I then realized that when the conductors would tell them, hey, you're just playing offbeats like this, up, down, up, down, that adding a footnote to explain that one extra detail might solve the problem, and one of the violists at the Tonhalle Orchestra in November of 2013 encouraged me to do that. So I added it to the bottom of the part, which you'll see here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And that clinched the deal. This is a perfect example of an evolving edit to the full score, which now contains the footnote at the bottom of the page in question, so the conductor knows it's in the viola parts and can direct the player's attention to it if they haven't noticed it. And an evolving edit to the part itself, as it began without any cue whatsoever, then a rhythmic cue was added to the part, and finally a footnote was added that clinched the deal. And in fact, at the Seattle Symphony's rehearsals in January of this year, 2015, the viola section played their part without a hitch, the first time this passage has been executed accurately in the 8 rehearsals and performances I've now attended, and perhaps ever, as this was never clarified in the 1965 score. Now let's turn to another edit in the viola part, and one I added on the recommendation of a player who approached me, as I asked everyone to do at every venue. Again, we start with a page from the full score, and then we'll target viola part. In this page, we have a dissonant treatment of Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, and the brass. And I'll zoom in on it so you can see it. Violas are playing this little figure that is off the main beat. Okay, so what's the problem with this? Well, in Lucerne, a violist approached me and explained that the passage was difficult for the viola section to play accurately because of its very nature. The violas are simply and it's difficult to keep the figure in place because they're repeating that figure a staggering 34 times, and it's not always on the beat, against the regularly pulsed music of the brass. She suggested to me that since the trumpets sound out on top of all the other players and are on the beat consistently, a cue staff showing the trumpet line should be put in the viola part throughout that passage to help the violas coordinate during those repetitions. So here's the result. Boom. Here's the viola part, and above it you can see the trumpet part as a cue. Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum 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 ba-dum. This has made all the difference for the violas playing this passage. And this is but one example of the many things that were done to the parts to help players coordinate in and of themselves and coordinate with other players. Now let's turn to one very interesting aspect of the score that has sadly also been misunderstood in the past: the ether organ part. Now, Ives calls for Mr. Theremin's ether organ to be used to double the cornet in 2 places in the second movement, and to double various instruments here and there in the fourth movement. It's always called ether organ, but it's always doubling other instruments. It's never playing unique lines. Now, it had long been assumed that Ives was referencing the famous and widely known theremin instrument, properly called the space-controlled theremin, as you can see here. But this is not true. Leon Theremin invented many instruments that worked on the ether wave principle, including theremin cellos, as seen in the middle here. And one of his instruments, sadly no examples of which survive, was the keyboard harmonium, an organ-like theremin in which each key controlled a separate theremin itself. And here it is in this poster from a 1932 demonstration of these instruments by Theremin himself. Here's the keyboard harmonium, just labeled keyboard here. Here's the theremin cello, it's called fingerboard. And here's the space-controlled theremin, which we just call the theremin. Now, I consulted the biographer of Leon Theremin, Albert Glenski, and we determined that it was this instrument over here that's labeled keyboard, the keyboard harmonium, not the commonly known space-controlled theremin over here that Ives saw at a live demonstration by Leon Theremin himself in New York in 1928. It was after seeing this demonstration of the keyboard harmonium that Ives returned to the Fourth Symphony score and circled instrumental lines indicating that this ether organ, get it as a keyboard instrument, should double them to reinforce them. Now, what does this mean? It means Ives never intended the commonly known theremin to play those parts, and it explains why he calls the part ether organ, not theremin, because it's a keyboard instrument. It also explains why he would write for it to double a line like this, shown here on the right in the ether organ part, which would be impossible to play on a standard space-controlled theremin. Now I'm going to zoom in on it, and let's take a look at this line right here. Imagine this being played by a space-controlled theremin. Bum 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 bum. I mean, forget it. This trumpet here could never be executed accurately on a space-controlled theremin. You know, additionally, theremins are notorious for being played out of tune. And when a theremin has been used in the past, it typically has stood out like a sore thumb and sounded awful. So what's the solution? The Own Martineau. It offers precise intonation, volume, and pitch inflection control by way of its slider and ribbon. And this is extremely important in passages where the ether organ is doubling the violins and is required to play a quarter tone that they are playing. It is suggested in the new edition that an Own Martineau be used for the ether organ part, and one was successfully used by the Tone Hollow Orchestra for its performance of this new edition in November 2013, and it was precisely what Ives intended, a warm enhancement of the strings and other instruments so that it doubles, providing them with an ethereal quality without drawing attention to itself, importantly. So, I strongly recommend that you encourage your music directors to enlist an Own Martineau player so that the ether organ part sounds as Ives intended it. The effect is truly wonderful. Now let's go back to the subject headings in the survival guide, and I'll go over them in broad detail. So here's the survival guide, and you can see that it's organized into sections that begin with bold-faced headings centered above them. I start off by discussing the number of conductors required for this work. And Ives acknowledges that there should be an assistant conductor for the second movement, and really you need not just one assistant conductor, but two, for a total of 3 conductors, because in the fourth movement, an on-stage assistant conductor is needed for one passage, and throughout the fourth movement, an off-stage conductor is required for the off-stage BU percussion, which is discussed later in the survival guide. I discussed the chorus as well, because there is a problematic word in the text sung in the first movement's Epiphany hymn, Watchmen Tell Us of the Night, that I never would have expected to cause any problems. But for non-native English speakers, that word and some others did prove to be problematic. The word in question was promise, and in German-speaking countries, the German choristers wanted to sing that word as promise. And even after they were being corrected by their music directors or choral directors, you could hear a mixture of promise and promise coming from the choir during the live performance. So to safeguard against this, I've added IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet, as an underlay in the choral part that they sing from, and also here in the survival guide, so the conductor can read and see exactly how these words are to be pronounced. I discuss in the next column the distant choir of 5 violins and harp, which is to be spatially removed from the main ensemble, off the stage somewhere, not to the side of the stage, but above the stage or somewhere in the hall. The harp part was previously thought only possible by 2 harpists because of its chromatic writing. Well, I went through the whole thing and found out that you could really do it with 1 harp if you respell it very carefully. And I checked my respelling with Anthony Madewell, the former principal harpist of the Sydney Symphony, and he confirmed that it worked. And wherever it's been done, I've actually queried the harpist whether or not the part was negotiable. And of course, they always respell the thing to suit their own technique, but they were always happy that someone had taken the time to demonstrate that it could be done. And that's what's really important. Now, there's one exception. The Tone Hollow Orchestra in Zurich, the harpist told me that she didn't even bother to respell it because she played through it with the spelling that I provided and it worked just fine. So what I provided does in fact work. String division. In the last movement, Ives divides the violins into 2 and then 3 broad groups in alternation. In doing so, he's not saying that there should be a third group that drops out and then comes back in again. No, no, no. He's talking about all the violins as one block that gets divided either into 2 parts or into 3 parts. And the way this is worked out is that the bottom chair players in desks 5 and 6 become the violin 3 section whenever it is sounding. And then in the violin 3 part itself, and the parts that have the violin 3 parts, those parts are marked with boxes. So here's a representative part that has violin 3 in a big box here and violin 3 in a box down here. This allows the conductor to call out violin 3 to the violin section and just conduct and rehearse those players, and they can know that they are the ones who are to rehearse at those points. I discussed the extra violin 2 and extra viola parts. I then discussed the high bells and low bells. Now, one of the problems in the past was often glockenspiel would be used for the high bells and orchestral chimes would be used for the low bells. Well, that's no good because Ives writes for a 6-octave range, and he specifies that it should be of light timbre throughout. Now, glockenspiel sounds 2 octaves higher than written, and chimes stop at middle C. And Ives goes 2 octaves below middle C, and he goes almost all the way, he goes to the topmost octave of the keyboard, of the piano keyboard. So you can't use orchestral chimes and glockenspiel to pull this off. Now you could use strung handbells that are struck with a mallet, but a better solution is provided with the rental materials currently, and that is an electronic realization to be performed on a keyboard by a skilled keyboardist. You will probably have to find a keyboardist to play it. It can't be one of the other keyboardists who are being employed throughout the symphony because they're going to be playing throughout. And it could only be a member of the percussion section who is a skilled keyboardist, him or herself. Gongs. Okay, prior to Turandot, which was completed in 1924, there was no use of the nipple gong in Western composition. Prior to 1924, the terms gong and tam-tam were used interchangeably, always in reference to the tam-tam. Well, this goes for the Ives 4 Symphony. When Ives writes for gong, he's writing for tam-tam. And so that's been put on the cover of the gong part so the percussionists know that they need to be playing on tam-tam. That's also explained here for the conductor. Beneath that, I discussed the Indian drum, and I'd seen everything from snare drums with the snares taken off to tom-toms being used for the Indian drum part, and that both of those solutions are bad. So I went to Andrew Stiller's authoritative treatise on instrumentation and grabbed the definition for an Indian drum, and I present it here in the survival guide, and it's also put on the cover of the Indian drum part. And basically what's wanted here is probably a medium powwow drum. And it's defined very clearly here in the definition. I talk about the celesta tessitura. The quarter tone piano part is something that has to be understood. Ives is not talking about a piano that's tuned off by a quarter tone. He's talking about a 24 note per octave instrument. He was basically imagining a piano with 2 manuals, one manual a quarter tone higher than the other. Now, fortunately for us, Ives only writes for a subset. So my solution has been to craft a scordatura tuning. And I worked closely with a professional tuner who is well respected in the tuning community, Edward Foote. And he devised for me a tuning that will work on both uprights and on grands that poses no threat to the instrument whatsoever. The strings are never being tightened too much or loosened too much, and the timbre is good, and it works. So the quarter tone piano part is actually a scordatura part, where the player just sits down and plays notes that look like they should be producing the notes that you expect to hear, but instead out come these quarter tones and regular tones that Ives is, intermingling. So even though a player may be playing an E flat, what might be coming out would be a D flat quarter tone sharp or something. Ether organ, I discussed that earlier. Don't use a theremin, use an Owen Martineau. I discussed the optional harp in the comedy. Then I discussed the placement of the pianos. You should definitely have the solo piano front and center and spatially removed from the orchestra piano on stage. The quarter tone notation throughout the score employs square-shaped notes, as Ives wrote them, but also to further clarify that they're quarter tones, I'm using the more conventional arrowed accidentals. I think it's the combination of square-shaped notes and arrowed accidentals that provide complete clarity that a given note is a quarter tone and not a regular tone. I discussed the alternative notations, how dynamics are not to be taken too literally. I discussed the prominence indicators, the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and circled letters that indicate distance. Then I go through and discuss the collapse section and other non-synchronized temporal effects. Every single passage that has something that is non-synchronized or is metrically complex, I denote here and describe in detail, so the conductor can then look at those passages and get his or her head around them. Most importantly is the relationship of the BU to the OU and movement 4. Now I'm going to zoom in on this because this is really important. Previously, conductors mistakenly thought that there was really no strict relationship between the two ensembles. And the way that the piece begins and ends is it starts with the percussion playing by itself, and then it ends with the main orchestra dropping out one instrument by another until only the percussion is sounding alone, again, just as they were sounding at the beginning of the movement. What had been done in the past, since no one really understood how these proportions worked, was just to have the percussion play its own tempo throughout, and if they finished before the main orchestra, they were simply instructed just to keep playing and vamp something, anything, and just be cut off by the main conductor at the end. Well, that's not right. Ives really worked hard at having all these proportions add up, and you can do it one of two ways. You can either have the main orchestra follow a temporal pattern that assumes a fixed tempo for the BU with changing tempos for the OU that are very, strict and exactly proportionate to the strict tempo of the BU. Well, that's not a very romantic way of approaching this. And in fact, this is perhaps the last great romantic symphony. And so I would advise against that. And so in this guide, I provide two different proportional charts. One where I give what the orchestra unit should be playing in terms of the static tempo of the BU. And then I give what the BU should be playing proportionate to whatever tempos the orchestra unit is affecting. And that's the more romantic solution because it allows for agogic tempo attenuations throughout the movement. Notice what the relationships are. Here it's, if you're having the OU follow the BU, the OU here is first 1.5 times the BU, then it's twice the BU, then it's 1.5 times the BU, then it's 1.25 times the BU, then it's 1.5 times the BU, then it's twice the BU, then it's 1.5 times the BU, and then it equals the BU. What is that? It's A, B, A, C, A, B, A, and a little A prime at the end. It's a temporal rondo. It is the spine of the movement. Ives worked this out very precisely. His math is absolutely accurate. And if you do not attend to these proportions, you're subverting Ives's intentions. And he actually wrote the percussion music to correspond to the character of the music the main orchestra is playing, especially in the Indian drum, that will speed up and slow down and play different material that corresponds to the energy that you find in the orchestra, in the main orchestra during those passages. So now we can actually execute the fourth movement the way that Ives intended it. I talk about the dynamic swell in the BU. Thrush calls in the last movement. There are little thrush calls that could be enhanced with flutter tongues and things like that in the last movement, if you wish, and the flutes and oboes and piccolo. There's one metric modulation I call a tempo malfunction in the comedy at measure 29. And I explain how that came to be. It has to do with the way that the measure in question evolved and different ways that a conductor can solve this problem. Otherwise, Ives's math is astoundingly accurate. This is the one boo-boo in the entire score in terms of his math. I discuss the interaction of the cellist and the solo piano in the first movement. Then I analyze the collapse section, determine exactly where the collapse should happen if you follow Ives's tempo. And then where the train wheels come to rest, and that's the section with the extra violin 2 continuing to play by itself and being revealed by the orchestra sort of stopping and revealing it and all that. It's interesting in the collapse section that where he indicates the basses to jump ahead to vamp that tremolo cluster chord is precisely where the collapse should occur if you follow his tempo acceleration. So his math is just is frighteningly good. Then I discuss a few remaining items, and one thing not explicitly spelt out in the survival guide at this point is how much time you need to put this piece together. And I've seen it put together in as many as 9 hours and as few as 3. And when it was done in 3 hours of rehearsal time, it was a complete disaster. When it was done with 9, it always was amazing. I think that a nice happy medium is actually about 7 hours. I think if you have about 7 hours of rehearsal time for this, you will have a real crackerjack performance that will really bring the piece to life and bring the audience, to their feet with a standing ovation. I think this is a piece whose time has finally come. And so the rest, said Hamlet, is silence. Thank you very much.